A glittering afternoon at the marina. A crowd gathered, the sun blazing down, when a single choice changed everything. Two women fell into the water. One was his mistress, the other his pregnant wife. And in full view of cameras and witnesses, he reached for the mistress and let his wife sink beneath the waves. What follows is a story of betrayal, loss, and a comeback so powerful it turns regret into his prison and freedom into her victory. Stay with us, because you will not believe how this ends until we walk through it together. Tell us what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We would love to hear from you. The midday sun blazed over the marina, pouring its light across the polished decks and glittering surface of the water. Guests in crisp linen suits and flowing summer dresses milled about, their laughter carried on the salt-scented breeze. It was supposed to be a pleasant afternoon gathering, a display of wealth and ease by the shoreline. The sparkling glasses of champagne, the polished wood of the pier, and the sound of gulls overhead painted a picture of leisure. Yet within seconds, all of that elegance collapsed into chaos. It started with raised voices that cut through the chatter. The husband, tall and sharp in his designer shirt, stood at the edge of the dock with two women, his pregnant wife and his radiant mistress. From a distance, it looked like a confrontation that might resolve with harsh words, but those who were close enough could see the tension, the clenched fists, the flushed faces. The wife clutched her swollen belly with one hand, her other hand stretched forward in a futile attempt to hold her ground. Her eyes were wide, not only with anger but with fear. The mistress smirked, leaning slightly toward the husband, as if victory was already hers. The argument grew louder. "You think you matter here?" the mistress snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. The husband said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. He turned his face slightly toward the mistress, his jaw tight, while his wife trembled under the harsh sunlight. The guests nearby tried to pretend they were not listening, but the sudden hush in the air revealed that every ear was tuned to the escalating storm. Then it happened. A shove, a slip of a shoe on the sun-heated boards, and both women toppled into the water below. Gasps rose from the pier as a splash shattered the quiet marina. The mistress's shriek tore through the air, high and panicked. The wife's cry was different. It was softer, desperate, carrying not only fear for her life but the weight of the child she carried within her. For one suspended moment, the husband froze. His eyes darted from the splashing figures in the water to the faces of the stunned onlookers. Phones came out, their cameras instantly recording. Sunlight bounced off the screens as red recording dots appeared. The world would see this, whether he wanted it or not, and then he made his choice. With a surge of movement, he lunged forward, his arm outstretched. His hand grabbed onto the mistress's wrist, pulling her from the water in one swift motion. She coughed and clung to him, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her fingers digging into his shirt as she sobbed. He held her tightly, whispering something no one else could hear. The crowd murmured, uncertain whether to cheer his quick reflexes or recoil at what they were witnessing. But the wife was still in the water. Her hands slapped against the surface as she tried to keep herself afloat. Her hair fanned out in the waves, her maternity dress heavy and dragging her down. She reached one hand toward the pier, toward her husband, toward the man she had trusted with her life and the life of their child. Her lips parted, choking out a cry that cracked with both fear and betrayal. "Help me, please." He did not move. His arms were already occupied with the mistress, his body turned away from the flailing woman who needed him most. Around him, guests cried out in disbelief. Some leaned over the rail, shouting instructions. A man tossed a rope, but it landed just out of her reach. The cameras continued to record, steady and unblinking. Her strength began to falter. The sun glared mercilessly on the scene, highlighting every detail of her struggle. The water splashed, then grew calmer as her motions slowed. One last desperate glance rose from her eyes, meeting her husband's. It was a look that held years of love, months of sacrifice, and a single instant of devastating clarity. And then she slipped beneath the surface. The mistress sobbed in the husband's arms. The crowd erupted in shouts. The pier shook with footsteps as people scrambled, too late to do what he had refused. The only sound that lingered was the echo of her plea, carried across the bright midday air, as the cameras kept their silent witness. Only months earlier, the same couple had appeared to be the very picture of happiness. The mornings in their grand seaside villa began with sunlight pouring through tall glass windows, filling the rooms with golden warmth. Neighbors who passed by often remarked on how perfect the family looked. The husband in his tailored suits, the pregnant wife in flowing dresses that highlighted her growing belly, both seemed to live in a storybook of success and prosperity. She remembered how he once whispered promises under the same sunlight. "Trust me, we are building the perfect family," he had said, pressing her hand to his chest. At that moment she believed him. She had set aside her own career and her own ambitions because he convinced her that her role was more important at home. He told her that her future was secure, that she would never need to worry. She believed every word. The villa itself told the story of their supposed happiness. The nursery upstairs was half finished, walls painted a soft pastel, a crib already delivered and waiting to be assembled. She had carefully folded tiny baby clothes into drawers, smiling as she imagined the day her child would wear them. He had promised to be there for every step, every milestone. The house staff often saw her humming as she arranged baby blankets, her face glowing with the simple joy of anticipation. On the surface, it looked idyllic. Friends who visited would admire the expensive furniture, the gleaming kitchen, the fresh flowers always set on the dining table. They would tell her how lucky she was, how blessed she seemed. She would nod and smile, holding her belly as if cradling both her future and her husband's promise in her hands. Yet inside her, doubt had already begun to grow. The doubt did not come from a single moment, but from many small details that gathered like shadows in the corners of bright rooms. He insisted on choosing her clothes, often commenting that a certain color was more flattering, or that another outfit looked too plain. He checked her phone under the excuse of protecting her, saying he did not want her stressed by trivial calls or bothersome messages. He controlled the grocery lists, the doctor's appointments, even the hours she was allowed to rest. Each action seemed small enough to dismiss, but together they formed invisible chains. At first, she told herself it was love. She told herself he cared too much, that his control was just another form of protection. But late at night, lying awake in the big bed, she wondered when her choices had stopped being her own. When had her opinion become nothing more than a suggestion that he could dismiss with a wave of his hand? There were moments when the truth almost slipped through. One afternoon, she looked in the mirror and barely recognized herself. The woman staring back looked tired, her smile thin, her eyes cautious. She remembered the vibrant woman she once was, standing in boardrooms, leading her own projects, making her own decisions. That woman felt like a ghost now. And still, in the daylight, she played the role of the happy wife. She walked through the villa with a gentle smile, answering questions from curious friends, pretending not to notice how often her husband disappeared into phone calls that lasted too long. When they dined together, he reminded her to sit straight, to smile more, to eat less sugar for the baby's sake. She obeyed because resisting only led to arguments that left her exhausted. The world outside saw perfection, but she felt the cracks forming under her feet. Every morning sunlight that streamed through the windows seemed a little harsher, revealing the truth she was trying so hard not to see. The truth did not crash into her all at once. It slipped in quietly, like water seeping under a locked door, until she could no longer ignore it. At first, it was the tone of his voice when he answered his phone. He would step out onto the terrace in the middle of the afternoon, shielding the screen with his hand, his words lowered into a softness she had not heard directed toward her in months. One afternoon, while folding baby clothes in the nursery, she heard laughter float through the open window. It was his laughter, light and warm, a sound she once lived for. But this time it was laced with something different. Curiosity pulled her to the window. She watched him standing by the pool, his phone pressed to his ear, his lips curved into a smile reserved for someone else. He spoke the words she used to hear at night. "I miss you too. Soon. Very soon." Her heart clenched, but she told herself she was imagining things. She returned to the nursery and placed a tiny blue blanket in the drawer. Still, the words echoed in her mind, louder than the waves outside. Days passed, but the signs multiplied. His shirts carried traces of perfume that was not hers, a scent too sweet and too bold for the quiet life she lived. Once, as she gathered his laundry, she found a folded note tucked inside his jacket pocket. The handwriting was elegant, the words careless. Last night was unforgettable. She stood frozen in the laundry room, the paper trembling in her hands. She confronted him once, gently, hoping she was wrong. "Who keeps calling you so late?" she asked at dinner. He did not even look up from his glass of wine. "Clients. You wouldn't understand." His dismissal cut deeper than anger could. It told her she was invisible, unworthy of an answer. The betrayal grew harder to hide. Friends began to avoid eye contact, Whispers lingered a little too long after she entered her room. One evening at a charity dinner, she caught the glance between her husband and a woman across the hall. It was quick, but it was unmistakable. His eyes softened, hers lit up, and a silent message passed between them. She pressed her hand against her belly, fighting back tears. Late one night, while he slept heavily beside her, she picked up his phone. The screen lit her face in the dark room. Messages filled the screen, sweet and intimate, written without fear. "When can I see you again? I dream of you every night. She will never know." Her chest tightened, her vision blurred. For a long time, she sat there in silence, the glow of the screen painting her face with betrayal. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed her cheek lightly, the gesture mechanical, and left for work. She stood by the window, watching his car pull away, the phone still heavy in her pocket. The sun outside was bright, almost cruel, shining on a world that looked the same while hers had already changed forever. She knew now. The life she thought she had was a lie. The promises whispered under the sunlight were hollow. The child inside her was real, but the love she had built her life on was gone. The day of reckoning came without warning. The sun was high, the sky a relentless blue, and the heat shimmered over the surface of the marina. Guests gathered on the pier, sipping chilled drinks and exchanging pleasantries, unaware that beneath the polished setting, a storm was building. The wife arrived quietly, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she walked toward the dock. She had seen enough, heard enough, and felt enough to know the truth. She had not come to argue in whispers anymore. Her steps were steady, her eyes sharp, though her heart thudded with a mix of dread and determination. The mistress was already there, standing close to the husband, her posture relaxed, her laughter echoing in the open air. She leaned toward him with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. When the wife's shadow fell across the boards, the mistress turned, and her smile sharpened into something cruel. "You should not be here," the mistress said, her voice loud enough for others nearby to hear. Her words cut through the easy music and chatter. Conversations died down, glasses paused mid-air, and faces turned toward the confrontation. The husband shifted uncomfortably but did not move closer to his wife. His silence was its own betrayal. The wife felt her throat tighten, yet she stood tall, her voice clear. "I am his wife. I am carrying his child. I have every right to be here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some lowered their eyes, too polite to stare openly. Others could not look away, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. The mistress took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Her eyes flashed in the sunlight, hard and mocking. "You think that means anything to him now? Look at me. Look at us. You are nothing but an inconvenience." She reached out, brushing her fingers over the husband's sleeve as if to prove her claim. The wife's hand trembled, but not from weakness. Her voice rose, steadier than she felt. "I gave up everything for this family. And you are tearing it apart." The husband finally spoke, his tone sharp, impatient. "Enough. You are making a scene." He turned his face toward the guests, trying to control the narrative, but the red flush on his skin betrayed his unease. The mistress seized the moment. With a sudden motion, she shoved against the wife's arm, her smile twisted into triumph. The wife stumbled back, her sandals scraping against the hot boards of the dock. The gasp of the crowd rose like a wave. In that instant of imbalance, the wife reached out, grabbing at the mistress's shoulder to steady herself. The motion pulled them both toward the edge. The husband shouted something, his words lost in the chaos, but it was too late. The two women toppled together, the sunlight flashing on their dresses, the air filling with the sharp cries of alarm. The water below swallowed them with a violent splash. One scream pierced the stillness, shrill and panicked. Another cry broke softer, almost drowned before it even left her lips. On the pier, the crowd rushed forward, their voices colliding in confusion. Phones lifted instinctively, recording every second, their screens reflecting the glare of the Sunday. The husband stood frozen, staring at the roiling surface of the water. His choice would come next, and everyone would see it. The splash still rippled across the marina when the husband finally moved. For a second he had stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight. The crowd was shouting now, their voices cutting through the midday air. Some pointed to the water, others cried out the wife's name. The sun glared mercilessly on the scene, giving no cover, no shadows to hide in. Two figures struggled in the water. The mistress flailed wildly, her arms striking the waves, her voice shrill and desperate. "Help me! "I cannot swim!" she screamed, coughing as water splashed against her face. The sound of her panic tore across the dock. The wife fought too, but her struggle was different. Her maternity dress had grown heavy with water, dragging her down. She tried to kick, tried to keep her head above the surface, but each movement seemed weaker than the last. Her eyes lifted toward the pier, toward the man she had trusted to protect her. "Please," she called, her voice rough, the word barely louder than the lap of the water. One hand reached upward, trembling, searching for the hand she thought would always be there. And then the choice was made. The husband lunged forward, dropping to his knees on the hot boards of the dock. His arm shot out, not toward the wife who was sinking lower, but toward the mistress who thrashed closer to the edge. His hand locked around her wrist with a grip of iron, hauling her upward with one violent pull. She collapsed against him, coughing, sobbing, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks. He wrapped his arms around her, murmuring words no one else could hear, his face pressed close to hers. Gasps spread through the crowd. Phones tilted, screens glowing, capturing the scene in steady frames. A woman in a summer hat shouted, "The wife. She is still in the water." Another man tossed a rope, but it landed just out of her reach. The wife's head broke the surface once more. Her eyes met her husband's, and in that brief instant the world seemed to still. Her face held no anger, only disbelief. Salt water streamed from her lips as she whispered again, "Please." He did not move. The mistress clung tighter to him, and his arms tightened in response. He turned his body slightly, shielding her as if the cameras and the crowd were threats to her safety. Behind him, the wife's cries grew weaker. Her arms slapped against the water, each motion slower than the one before. Her dress billowed around her like a trap, pulling her down inch by inch. A collective murmur rose from the guests. Some leaned dangerously over the rail, shouting instructions, begging him to act. Others simply watched, their hands covering their mouths, stunned by what they were witnessing. The midday sun reflected off the surface of the water, blinding and cruel, making every second feel longer. At last, her strength failed. The wife's hand lifted once more, fingers stretching upward in a final plea. Her eyes, wide with both fear and clarity, locked onto her husband's face. She saw the truth there. She saw the choice he had already made. Then she slipped beneath the surface. The mistress whimpered in his arms, pressing her face against his chest. He stroked her hair, whispering something soft, as if nothing else mattered. Behind them, voices shouted, feet pounded, ropes were thrown again and again. But the woman who needed him most was gone from sight, swallowed by the water that glittered under the merciless afternoon Sunday. The cameras kept recording. The sea did not claim her forever. Hours later, as the sun began to soften into late afternoon, a small fishing boat spotted movement near the rocks beyond the marina. Two fishermen leaned over the edge, their weathered hands pulling her half-conscious body from the waves. Her lips were pale, her hair tangled and heavy with salt, and her swollen belly rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. They wrapped her in an old blanket that smelled of smoke and seaweed, their voices low but urgent. "Stay with us, ma'am. You are safe now." Her eyelids fluttered, but she did not respond. She clutched at the blanket weakly, as though she still expected someone else to be there, the one who had chosen to turn away. By the time the ambulance reached the dock, she was barely aware of her surroundings. The sirens wailed, echoing through the narrow streets on the way to the hospital. She lay strapped to the stretcher, her skin clammy, her hands curled around nothing. Nurses rushed to meet her as the gurney rolled through bright white hallways, voices sharp with commands. "Get fluids ready. Check the fetal monitor. Call the obstetrician now." The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air. Machines beeped steadily, their lights blinking in rhythm. Cold gel spread across her stomach as the probe traced over her skin. The monitor screen flickered, searching for the reassuring heartbeat that should have been there. For a long moment, the room was filled only with static sounds. The doctor's brow furrowed, his eyes darkening. Then silence. The silence was louder than any alarm. The steady beat they all waited for never came. The doctor lowered the probe, placing a hand gently on her arm. "I am so sorry," he said softly. His words were simple, but they shattered everything. "The baby is gone." Her eyes opened wide, confusion turning into horror. "No, no, you are wrong," she whispered, shaking her head. Her hand flew to her belly as though she could shield it, protect what was no longer there. Tears welled and spilled down her cheeks, sliding into her hair. She cried out, the sound raw, echoing against the white walls. Nurses shifted uncomfortably, some bowing their heads. The doctor gave her a moment, standing in quiet respect for the grief flooding through her. She clutched her stomach, rocking slightly, her cries breaking into gasps. "I promised I would keep you safe," she whispered, as if speaking to the child who had slipped away. The hours that followed blurred into shadows and fluorescent light. They moved her into a private room, curtains drawn against the sun that still burned outside. She lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, her face streaked with tears. The blanket covered her but could not warm her. Every sound of the hospital around her footsteps, carts rolling, doors opening, felt distant, as though she were already somewhere else. When the nurse returned with paperwork and soft words of comfort, she barely moved. "You are alive," the nurse said gently, placing a hand over hers. "That means you still have a chance to begin again." But the wife turned her head, staring out the window at the fading sky. Alive, yes, but hollow. Something inside her had been torn away. In that sterile room, grief became her companion. The betrayal at the dock, the cruel choice of her husband, and now the loss of the child she had carried. The future she had imagined was gone. What remained was a silence that pressed against her chest, heavier than the waves that had nearly taken her life. Days passed in a haze of grief. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. The curtains stayed drawn, blocking the bright sun outside. She lay curled on her side, staring at nothing, her hand resting on her flat stomach. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of the life she had carried, the child who was gone. The world might have left her there, forgotten in her silence, if not for a nurse who refused to let her drown in despair. The woman was older, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined with years of compassion. She entered the room each morning with the same gentle firmness, setting down a fresh glass of water, adjusting the blanket, and speaking words that seemed small but carried weight. "You are still here," the nurse would remind her, pulling the curtains back to let light spill into the room. "That means there is still hope. Do not give him the power to take everything from you." At first the wife turned away, unwilling to hear, but slowly the words began to settle inside her, like seeds waiting for the right moment to grow. One afternoon, the nurse sat beside her and held her hand. "You are not alone, my dear. You may feel broken, but you are stronger than you know. Pain does not end you. Sometimes it is what begins you again." The words drew tears, but this time the tears were different. They carried not only grief, but also the faintest spark of possibility. That same evening, another visitor arrived. A man in a dark suit stepped quietly into the room, carrying a briefcase. His eyes softened when he saw her, and he spoke her name with warmth. It was an old friend, a lawyer she had once known before her world had been consumed by her husband's control. He had heard what happened. He had come because he refused to let her suffer alone. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, his voice steady. "But you still have choices to make. You do not have to remain under his shadow." He placed a folder on the small table beside her bed. Papers slid out, filled with words she did not want to face but knew she needed. Divorce documents, protective orders, legal steps that could free her. Her hands trembled as she touched the papers. For months, maybe years, she had felt trapped, convinced she had no way out. Now here it was, printed in black and white, a door opening. "I do not know if I can," she whispered, her voice thin. The lawyer leaned forward, his tone kind but firm. "You can. He made his choice that day on the dock. Now it is time for you to make yours. These papers are not only about ending a marriage, they are about beginning your life again." The nurse returned then, standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "We will stand with you," she said simply. The wife looked at them both, the two people who had shown her more care in these few days than her husband had in years. With a deep, shaking breath, she picked up the pen. Her fingers pressed against the cool metal, her hand unsteady, but her resolve stronger than she realized. She signed her name. The sound of the pen scratching against paper felt like thunder in the quiet room. For the first time since the water closed over her head, she felt air fill her lungs fully. The weight on her chest shifted, not gone, but lighter. She had lost her child, her trust, and her old life, but she had not lost herself. In that hospital room, guided by kindness and strength, she began to take back what was hers. Months passed, and the world assumed she had disappeared. Rumors spread quietly. Some whispered she had gone abroad to heal. Others claimed she had never survived that terrible day at the marina. Her husband did nothing to correct them. He continued to host events with the mistress on his arm, smiling for the cameras, pretending the scandal had blown away like sea foam. He did not expect her to rise again, but she had been preparing in silence. With the nurse's encouragement and the lawyer's guidance, she rebuilt herself piece by piece. She moved into a modest apartment far from the villa, attended therapy sessions, and joined a support group for women who had endured betrayal and abuse. The papers had been filed, the legal path set in motion. Each day, her steps grew steadier, her voice stronger, and when the time came, she chose her moment carefully. The event was grand, a corporate gala hosted in the ballroom of a luxury hotel, filled with investors, journalists, and executives. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. Cameras flashed as the husband made his entrance, his mistress clinging proudly to his arm. He wore his usual mask of confidence, though whispers still trailed him like shadows. He believed he controlled the story. He believed she was gone. Then the doors opened. Every head turned. The room hushed, conversations breaking off mid-sentence. She stepped inside, tall and radiant in a gown of pure white that caught the light of the chandeliers. Her hair was pulled back with elegant simplicity, her posture steady, her eyes fierce. The effect was undeniable. For months they had spoken of her as broken, forgotten, erased. Now she stood before them, alive, unyielding, transformed. The mistress gasped audibly, her hand tightening on the husband's sleeve. He stiffened, his face paling as if he had seen a ghost. The cameras snapped furiously, reporters whispering her name. "It's her. She's alive." The air filled with the rustle of astonishment, 1,000 questions left unspoken. She did not rush. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with calm precision, each step deliberate. The crowd parted as though guided by some invisible force. She walked directly toward the stage, her eyes never leaving the man who had abandoned her in the water. He shifted in place, his usual arrogance cracking under the weight of her gaze. The mistress whispered something to him, her face pale, her lips trembling. He did not answer. His eyes remained locked on the woman he thought he had left behind forever. She stopped at the edge of the stage, letting the silence stretch, letting every camera capture the moment. Then she spoke, her voice calm but carrying across the ballroom. "Did you really believe I would vanish? That I would drown quietly so you could rewrite the story?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Her words struck like lightning, impossible to ignore. She lifted her chin, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "You all deserve to know the truth." The cameras flashed brighter, reporters leaning forward, pens scratching furiously. The husband's lips parted, but no sound came. The mistress's eyes darted toward the exits, searching for escape. But there was no escape. She had returned not as the fragile wife they remembered, but as a woman forged in betrayal and loss, standing in the light of day with the strength of survival. The gala that was meant to celebrate his empire had become the stage for her resurrection. And everyone knew it. The ballroom hung in silence after her words. The chandeliers glittered above, their light harsh on the faces of people who had once applauded the husband's power. The mistress trembled beside him, her smile gone, her eyes darting nervously across the sea of onlookers. He tried to straighten his posture, tried to summon the authority that had carried him through boardrooms and interviews, but his hands betrayed him. They shook at his sides. Then she raised her hand, and everything changed. The lawyer who had guided her through months of rebuilding stepped forward from the crowd. In his hands were folders and a small flash drive. He placed them on the podium with deliberate care. The sound echoed louder than expected, like a gavel striking in court. Murmurs rippled as journalists leaned closer, cameras ready. She opened the folder and held up photographs. "These," she said clearly, "were taken the night I nearly drowned. They show who he chose to save and who he abandoned." Gasps spread as the images passed from hand to hand, printed stills captured from phones. The husband pulling the mistress onto the dock, the wife's hand stretching above the water, ignored. The red recording light glowing in the corner of the frame. Next came documents, financial records with his signature. And these prove where his money went. Funds diverted to secret accounts, gifts for the woman he paraded as his partner while his wife carried his child. Her voice did not tremble. It rang out, steady and sharp, each word a blade. The mistress's face drained of color. She shook her head, whispering, "No, this cannot be real." But the papers in front of her left no room for denial. Reporters shouted questions. "Did you know about this? How long has this been going on? What do you have to say?" Microphones appeared, their black foam tips aimed like arrows at the husband's face. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat worked, his lips moved, but the only sound was a weak cough. Then she delivered the final blow. She pressed a button on the projector. The screen behind them lit up with a video, grainy but unmistakable. The marina, the sunlight, the chaos, her voice crying for help, his arm reaching for the mistress. The camera never flinched, never lied. The ballroom erupted. Investors turned to one another in shock. Some pushed back their chairs, standing abruptly. One man pulled out his phone, muttering, "Sell everything now." Another shook his head in disgust. "We cannot be tied to him anymore." The tide of power shifted in an instant. Contracts dissolved with a glance. Trust shattered beyond repair. The husband's face glistened with sweat. He tried to step forward, but his legs faltered. The mistress clutched his arm, begging him to say something, anything. But the weight of evidence was crushing. Every eye in the room judged him. Every camera captured his downfall. The wife, once voiceless, now stood as the force that toppled his empire. She did not raise her voice, she did not gloat. She simply let the truth speak for itself, and the truth was enough. By the time security approached, whispers had turned to shouts. Some called for his arrest, others demanded he resign. The mistress pulled away, realizing the empire she clung to was sinking fast. Her high heels clicked rapidly against the marble floor as she fled toward the exit. He remained behind, shoulders sagging, face pale, eyes hollow. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and headlines now stood exposed as a coward, a liar, and a betrayer. And she stood opposite him, steady, calm, her head lifted high. For the first time in years, she was the one holding all the power. The ballroom buzzed with voices, a storm of outrage and disbelief. Reporters shouted questions. Investors hurried for the exits, their phones pressed to their ears as they called to salvage what remained of their fortunes. Security stood nearby, waiting for orders that would never come. In the middle of it all, she stood still, her presence commanding more than the chandeliers above or the chaos around her. She looked at the husband, the man who had once promised her the world, the man who had let her drown in more ways than one. He could not meet her eyes. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped, his polished shoes fixed on the marble floor. He was no longer the confident figure who had strutted into the gala with his mistress. He was small now, stripped of power, crumbling under the weight of the truth. The room quieted as she stepped toward the microphone. The cameras turned, their red lights glowing. For a heartbeat, she let the silence hang, the world holding its breath to hear her speak. Her voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "I lost my child because of betrayal," she said. Her words carried through the hall, each one clear, each one undeniable. "But I will not lose myself. I will not let lies define me any longer. The truth has freed me, and it will follow him for the rest of his life." The crowd erupted in applause, not wild, but strong and certain, like a wave rolling across the room. Women in elegant gowns wiped tears from their eyes. Men shook their heads in disbelief at the man who had fallen so far. And in the middle of it all, she stood with dignity, her back straight, her eyes bright. The husband finally lifted his gaze. His lips parted, as if to speak, but nothing came. His throat tightened, his chest heaved, but no words could undo the choices he had made. The mistress was gone, the empire collapsing, and the wife he had cast aside now stood as the only truth left. Regret etched itself across his face, deep and heavy. He would carry it long after the cameras stopped recording. She stepped away from the microphone. The lawyer met her with a reassuring nod. The nurse, standing in the crowd, clasped her hands together with pride. Together they watched her walk across the ballroom, her heels clicking against the marble, each step a declaration of freedom. As she reached the grand doors, she paused. She turned back one final time, her eyes sweeping the room, lingering only briefly on the husband who now looked like a shadow of himself. "No power can bury the truth," she said softly. Though her voice was gentle, the words cut sharper than any blade. Then she turned and walked into the sunlight waiting outside. The cameras followed her until the doors closed. Inside, the man who once controlled everything stood alone, surrounded by the ruins of his pride. Outside, the woman who had been betrayed walked forward into a future she would build on her own terms. The applause still echoed behind her, but she no longer needed it. She had found something greater than approval. She had found herself.